Well, welcome, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here with you and discuss the nature of mind, which is probably the single most fascinating subject, at least to the human mind. So maybe we should jump right into it by saying, according to a great number of neurologists, physiologists, psychologists, even philosophers, consciousness is nothing more than an epiphenomenon or side effect of certain brain processes. And this is often treated almost as dogma. Could you tell me a little bit about your attitude toward this theory and your responses to it?
So I would say that we'd first want to distinguish between epiphenomenalism, which is to say that consciousness really serves no role at all, and material reductionism, which is to say that consciousness can be understood within the standard framework of thinking about matter, and it's just a particular kind of matter and process, not qualitatively different from any other. I actually disagree with both, or lean towards disagreeing with both, but I think they're separate issues. I think that epiphenomenalism is the strongest claim that basically consciousness just doesn't do anything at all. It's just like the steam that's come out of the top of a steam locomotive. And there certainly are philosophers and neuroscientists who hold that view, but I think there's also many who would characterize themselves as material reductionists in the sense that they don't think that consciousness involves anything different from other types of things, but they're not epiphenomenalists in that they would say that that the conscious experience is one step in the process that information processing goes through, and during the conscious period, certain things take place, and so it serves a role, and likely evolution favored conscious organisms because they were able to do things that other organisms or that things that weren't conscious couldn't. And so I don't think we'd want to equate epiphenomenalism with material reductionism. I would definitely agree that material reductionism is the prevailing view. That is the belief that consciousness is just going to be understood in the same way that we've come to understand, electrons and other things in the physical universe. And I think that that's a defensible perspective. Certainly, it's gotten us a long way in terms of understanding everything else in the world to a significant degree. But I also personally think that it's a limited perspective, and that there are alternative ways of thinking about consciousness, and that it's defensible to think about consciousness in alternative ways. So the one thing I really disagree with the sort of the standard party line is the view that it's not acceptable or defensible to consider any perspective other than material reductionism.
That makes sense. All right. Well, while we're on the subject, what is consciousness anyway?
Okay. So actually, this is something which there's actually been increased agreement. And this comes from the philosopher Nagel's famous article, What It's Like to Be a Bat, in which he basically defines consciousness as there's something it's like to be that whatever is conscious. So essentially, consciousness is equated with experience. If you're having an experience, then you're conscious. If a bee is capable of suffering or of pleasure or of any qualia, any internal experience, it's conscious. And so it may be difficult to empirically demonstrate, but each one of us decidedly has a conscious experience. We know from a first person perspective that if there's something it's like to have experience, and that something is consciousness.
Very good. Well, in some of your works, you seem to incline toward a view called panpsychism, which essentially holds that some perhaps very primitive or primordial consciousness inheres in everything, both living and apparently inanimate. Is that more or less your view?
Well, again, I have this sort of entertaining without endorsing view, and I think that panpsychism has a number of very compelling elements, and it's really worthy of consideration. And I've written several papers that have sort of promoted a panpsychist view. I think so. Panpsychism is the notion that really consciousness goes all the way down to some absolutely fundamental element. Leibniz referred to them as monads. It could be something as low as strings, and then that the as things get larger, they may or may not get larger amounts of consciousness. So uh, this desk here, it very likely does not have. There's no consciousness. There's nothing it's like to be the desk, but there could be something it's like to be the individual particles within the desk, that's sort of where some sort of proto consciousness exists. I think that in that scenario, what life does is it provides the organization to allow these lower level sort of base level windows to organize into higher and higher windows, something that I refer to as nested observer windows. So you might imagine that a protein possibly is a larger window, and there might be something it's like to be a protein. And then there may be organelles. There might be something it's like to be a mitochondria. And then there might be something it's like to be a individual cell or an individual neuron. And then there might be something it's like to be a neural circuit, and then finally up to the highest level window, which my colleague Justin Riddle and I refer to as the apex window, which is where all those lower level windows get put together. And the metaphor that we use here is a mosaic photograph. So in a mosaic photograph, every pixel of the photograph is itself a photograph. And you can imagine every pixel of that lower level photograph also being composed of smaller photographs and smaller photographs. And so in that same way, we imagine proto-consciousness could get combined into larger and larger nested observer windows, and then ultimately to the level of us. And critically, each one of us could be a pixel and yet some higher level window. So this raises the possibility of higher level windows, but that window shouldn't get too full of itself because it could be a pixel and yet a higher level window as well. So I think panpsychism is a logically coherent and a really intriguing view, but I also think it's possible that that emergentism might also, at the end of the day, turn out to be what's going on, that there may require some combination of things before any consciousness happens at all. And I've, in my papers, I've actually have a footnote where I take issue with my co-author and say, one of us thinks it goes all the way down, the other one thinks it might go all the way down, but is also open to the possibility of emerging at some higher level.
Yeah, one man who would seem to agree with this position was Edison, who in an 1890 interview, said, look at all of these atoms and chemicals and the marvelous ways in which they're capable of reacting with one another. And do you mean they do this without some kind of awareness? I believe he used the word awareness. So he seems to have been well in advance of this current wave of panpsychism.
William James also was entertained panpsychism. So it has a long history. And as I mentioned, Leibniz believed in panpsychism as well, thinking that everything was composed of these conscious monads.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so the idea, one way or another, goes back. So, in any case, why? Well, let's talk a little bit about another subject that you've discussed in your writing, which is free will. And the question is there such a thing? In Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, someone remarks the free willers and the predestinationists were tied in the fourth quarter, last I heard. So could you comment on that enormous topic?
Well, I would have to say that if you were to ask philosophers and psychologists, it'd actually be interesting to do this, to do a poll. My guess is that the majority of them would say that the predeterminists are ahead, and that free will is not looking too good. But I would disagree with them. I think that at a very minimum, there's an even match, and I lean towards what's known as libertarianism and the notion that consciousness may have its own causal power unto itself. I think it's also important to keep in mind that this question is not just does free will exist, but also what are the ramifications of believing in free will, and how do people conceptualize free will in their everyday lives? And there's been a lot of really interesting research that's emerged from looking at people's sort of lay beliefs about free will, which is a related but distinct question.
Well, I mean, the predestinationist model, which then would deny free will, would indicate that basically everything is merely, shall we say, a series of mechanical reactions, or neurochemical reactions, or physical reactions, or whatever. So if this is all just one enormous chain of reactions, what is it all about? I mean, why is it here? It seems like a lot of trouble for somebody to go through, even to have a universe, or even to be in a universe.
Well, I think that taking it from that perspective, they'd say that's asking the wrong question. There doesn't need to be any reason why anything is here. It just is here, and that's part of their story. That a sort of a naturalist a perspective doesn't require sort of a teleology of a sort of explaining why things are here. They just take that as a given. That said, I think that oftentimes when people have this sort of naturalist perspective, they don't really recognize all the major assumptions that they're making to take the given as a given. To take one example, one way in which naturalists explain the remarkable number of coincidences, or sorry, remarkable number of unique values that had to be exactly what they are in order for us to exist, is to postulate that we are one of just many, many multiverse of different universes with different various constants of different sorts. And so with enough different universes, with enough different constants, then it all makes sense that this could naturally occur, that one would have to have this particular timeline with all these things taking place in the particular way that it does. And it's just a product of enough trials. Some of them are going to turn out this way. But that presumes this incredible assumption, of course, which is all these infinity or near infinity of multiple alternative universes with different values for which we have no evidence. So it's a little bit like choose your poison. Either there's no real purpose or value or anything to the universe. It just happened to be one of the many, many universes that exist, but you have to assume all these universes that we have no evidence for, or there actually is some teleology. There actually is some sort of intelligence, purpose, or something of that sort that's driving. And of course, there could be many other explanations for why things are here. I will just conclude by saying, from phenomenologically speaking, it does feel like we have free will in a very strong way. And even people who deny free will acknowledge that they live their lives as if they have it. So it's curious that they're choosing their axioms in such a way that they conflict with their lived experience so dramatically.
Yeah, it's a little bit like evolution. I mean, it's all theoretically processes of random selection and random mutation and natural selection. But if you start looking at evolutionists' accounts, and I mean even those rigid neo-Darwinists, somehow it design still comes in. They themselves use the word design. So on the one hand, they refuse to, but they can't even explain their own theory without invoking design. And that, to me, is a serious problem. I mean, if to go back to your naturalist view, well, I guess with these multiverses, as you say, there are all these multiverses that are posited, which not, and or you can say there's one supreme being who designed them, and the latter theory would have the advantage of Occam's razor, in which multiple unnecessary entities are not multiplied. So I don't know. Those are some questions I have. I mean, this naturalist position. I mean, does it make any sense to you? I mean, going back to this, what about this makes some sense to you at a gut level? Because I think some of your articles bring that into account. Like, what of this does make sense to you, really? Quite apart
Sure.
from all of the reasonings.
Yeah. Well, let me just say a couple things on that. First, I think that my using the term naturalist maybe is not the right term, because I think that there are alternative characterizations of the nature of consciousness and physical matter that could be expanded into a naturalist account, but into a broader naturalist account where consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality, and where we come to understand it as having properties much in the way that we understand time and other characteristics. Indeed, I've postulated that we can imagine the consciousness as involving these windows that are oftentimes represented by living animals and maybe even plants as moving through three dimensions of time, as opposed to just the standard one dimension of time, where the additional dimensions, the standard objective dimension is one, but then we also have subjective time. And so we're moving in objective time relative to subjective time. And it's our relationship between objective and subject that experience happens. And then there's also, we postulate alternative time, which is the way in which we're able to actually not be locked into a single destiny, but rather can steer potentially with consciousness into alternative realities. Now, you mentioned the notion of God, or some sort of big intelligence, which is sort of designed everything. And I think that's definitely a defensible perspective. You could also imagine that we're in some sort of simulation, and in that sense, God would be the designer of the simulation, but there would then they could also be in the simulation, and then there'd be someone who was their God, and so on. So there could be this hierarchical thing of that sort. But I also think that it's very possible that that there is that the driver is driven by the intentions of the individual windows, and that there's no giant designer which is necessarily driving everything, but at every level the windows are making choices, and those choices are moving in informationally rich directions. So all the windows have a little bit of leeway. They're all moving into the interesting part of information space, and that's how we got through this sort of collective, all of us working together, into this really, really interesting part of information space where the universe is as it is. So I think there are multiple ways of building some sort of purpose into models, and the idea that every individual window has some imperatives to it, perhaps for information as being a critical one, for organization, that also could lead to the level of organization that we have today. So it's important, I think, to keep a variety of different explanations on the table. I will admit, though, that in one sense, this view of it all being sort of built up from the bottom up is sort of defies Occam's razor, in the sense that you have to have all these different little windows having their own thing. But also what it's suggesting is that with some very simple principles, like, there's a AI program, Life, where you have these very basic low-level principles, and that then builds into these very complex designs. It's possible that by building in some very basic imperatives into all these conscious nested observer windows, that premise leads to increasingly interesting and increasingly complex realities, much like the one that we live in. So it's possible that at a meta level, it's actually quite parsimonious.
Could you say a little bit more about exactly what you mean by windows in this sense?
Sure. So the idea is at a first off, it's sort of an information level. A window is a nexus of information integration. So it really is equivalent to a pixel, excuse me, a window in a photograph, which has integrated all the lower level pixels into something. And then that window, if you then zoom out, you'll see that window really just sort of having a singular, it'll sort of blur into a single sort of representation. So each window is a locus of a lower level information that has been integrated into sort of a singular state. And right now, your apex, you're experiencing your apex, and that's a window. But let me give you some intuitions about other parts of your body, which might be their own nested observer window. And one that I've been thinking about lately is your tongue, right? So the tongue really does kind of have a mind of its own, right? You'll catch it cleaning your teeth, and it's doing all sorts of things on its own. You don't, but at the same time, you can zoom in and sort of notice what it's doing, and it's integrating the tongue. Of course, the tongue-brain connection as a sort of a combined thing. It's integrating a whole lot of the individual taste buds, which each taste bud could be a window unto itself. And then they're organizing lower level ones. So it's these nexuses of information integration. And the conjecture is that each one of these windows may have their own stream of consciousness. We're like this sort of society, hierarchical society of mind.
Well, I don't know if this is what you're saying or not, but uh, some of what you said seems to sound like you're characterizing information in a somewhat atomistic way, that these windows are, in a sense, made up of information. But this gets problematic because, as I see it, information doesn't exist in itself. There has to be something, as the signified, the signifier, and someone that it's signifying something to. So, information can't, in my opinion, be this kind of simple atomistic unit. Does that make any sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense. And that's why, well, I think it's possible that it could exist without it. So I don't take that as a given, but I think that that's a really reasonable conjecture. And that's why the notion that each one of these windows is itself conscious, and thereby that which allows it to actually be a source of understanding at its individual level, which then gets incorporated into larger and larger understandings, is so intuitive to me. So if you do think that information requires consciousness of or understanding of a certain sort, then to build understanding into all the levels makes great sense. So I don't think that has to be the case, but if it were, this model really would help to accommodate information in that manner.
Okay, interesting. Well, let's go on to the equally fraught subject of spirituality. The spiritual or religious impulse in the human being is universal, and our society would apparently be an aberrant among all known past, present, and future in denying that there's really any such thing or that's it's of any importance whatsoever. So where does spirituality, which is so central to so many people, fit into the model you're discussing?
Well, there's lots of different ways that it could. As I mentioned, each one of us could be a pixel in a higher level window, and then also there's a certain sense in which another metaphor, and they say you shouldn't mix metaphors, but I think that's exactly wrong. I think every metaphor offers a different vantage in which to look at a problem and can be very helpful. And you always just have to recognize to not mistake the metaphor or recognize the metaphor as such. But another metaphor is, rather than imagining these windows sort of moving through time, imagining time moving through the windows. So it's as if essentially each window is like a kite, and the wind is sort of blowing blowing past it. And so we're all in what I refer to as this kite of consciousness. We're all tethered together. We all have our own little bit of individual, like a sail in a multi-sailed kite. We have our own little bit of individual movement, but we're all tethered together, and we're all in this sort of giant kite, which may have giant, even larger windows behind us, even which we could be referred to as spirituality. These larger windows that are integrating our experiences. And so this sort of kite of consciousness moving through information, or moving through information potentiality, is a way of thinking about one way of thinking about spirituality. Another part that sort of relates to spirituality is, as I was mentioning before, that imagining that every single little bit of matter has its own little imperative, has its own perspective. And so that creates a universe that's alive in a certain sense, because it's constructed of all these conscious things. There's experience happening even in those distant planets without a life, potentially, and potentially the whole universe could be an apex, could be an apex window, but maybe it's not. Maybe even it's a pixel and yet some higher level window. So by imagining consciousness throughout the physical world, that creates a kind of spirituality. It also creates, so if we're all together, we're all tethered together as these windows, then my movement will impact the movement of the entire kite. And so there's a certain way in which every single one of us, every one of our actions can influence the whole, and this sense of connection falls out from the model.
Yeah, well, that's what a lot of the esoteric traditions say. They usually use the image of the cosmic man or the cosmic human, the Adam Kadmon of the Kabbalists. Hinduism calls it the Purush. There are various names for it. So that if that is the case, that was certainly would have been intuited by a number of particularly mystical traditions.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask you about something you wrote here. You'd say scientists' perennial tendency to overstate the evidence for their respective positions, which I find fascinating. And how do you think this affects the direction of thought and the current of intellectual life? I mean, I think you've been very cautious in stating your views fairly provisionally, but obviously many of your colleagues are not like that. I'm wondering what kind of effect you think that's had on the discourse.
Well, I'm sure I've overstated my case plenty of times as well. I think it's human nature to sort of take the evidence that we have and try to make the most of it that we can. And so I think scientists are just sort of doing what all of us humans tend to do. That said, I do think that particularly when it comes to ontology, when it comes to sort of the basic assumptions about the nature of reality, that that scientists have taken liberties to make claims and assumptions about the nature of reality, saying that we know that free will is an illusion. We know that we live in a material reductionist world. We know that there's no life after death. The notion of some sort of spirit or soul is obviously false. A whole bunch of these metaphysical claims, which are totally defensible as one's own personal axioms to exist by, but to say that science has proven these things, I think really is an overstatement, and you can make a case for why that is in all the different situations that I mentioned. So I think that the tendency to overgeneralize the implications of our findings becomes especially problematic when scientists are making claims about the fundamental nature of reality. And I really think they should be spending more time, rather than just dismissing these fundamental ontological questions, investigating their own axioms and recognizing that they've chosen these as axioms, but that there could be other axioms that would lead to different conclusions.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. Scientists may just say, "Well, look, I'm just focusing on my narrow little band here, and I really can't comment on, the larger things." I think the thing I find disturbing is all of those axioms you just set out are basic working assumptions in both present-day academic psychology and present academic philosophy,
Yeah.
which ought to be able to deal with these fundamental ontological questions. But there seems to be this blanket assumption that all of this stuff is proven in a way that's allegedly scientific, but as you pointed out yourself, completely unscientific. So, and I personally find that troubling because this reductionistic view of the human being seems to be having severe social consequences. And, millions of people are anxious, depressed, upset. We know supposedly about how the human mind works better than anybody ever did any time in the history of the world. Yet, for some reason, people are more miserable than ever.
One of my great heroes is the philosopher and psychologist William James. And what's so interesting is that uh, all of my colleagues, certainly any colleague who studies consciousness, routinely cites William James. And if William James is known to have said something, it gives it immediate credibility. And what's so interesting is that William James had very much the same misgivings about the material reductionist perspective that I'm articulating right now. Indeed, I've been influenced by him. And he has a really lovely essay on immortality in which he makes, and you might think, well, this was written 100 years ago. It's not informed by modern neuroscience, but he's aware of the same kind of neuroscientific claims that neuroscientists pose now. For example, that as people experience mental illnesses or brain damage, that their minds change. That you see sort of loss of consciousness and all these arguments for a materialist perspective on consciousness. And he points out that yes, the mind could be the generator of consciousness, but it could just be a receiver. And in the same way that a receiver, when broken, will create distorted messages, so too a brain, when it's distorted, can create these problems. And he makes a very compelling case, I think, that the view that consciousness is generated by the brain, which of course is a key assumption of the material reductionist perspective, is just an assumption. It's a defensible assumption, but not the only one. And I wish that that scientists would pull out their heroes' articles on these types of issues and think about them deeply. But to your larger point, I think that we've taken away, science has taken away the meaning in people's lives by telling them that their religious beliefs are mere fictions. And if that was an absolute necessity, then so be it. If the flat earthers, despite however much meaning they may get out of thinking the Earth is flat, I'm sorry, but it's simply not, and they need to suck it up on that. But when it comes to the fundamental ontology, whether or not there's some sort of intelligence that is embedded in reality that we're not aware of, scientists don't have the final say on that yet. And until they do, I think they need to maybe show a little bit more humility.
Yeah, actually, just at lunchtime today, I was reading an article in The Economist, which the headline basically said the Church of England is dying. And without going into the details about that, it would seem that one reason, particularly liberal mainstream religion is dying, is that a lot of its clergy have been kind of inducted, had this induced view of materialism given to them and not much anything else. So they can't really tell anybody anything, so nobody comes anymore. So, I mean, that would not be the failure of scientists, or it would be the failure of the clergy, who just haven't well managed to get their story straight. But obviously, these things are having very severe social consequences. I mean, since we're talking about James, let's go to his pragmatism. And I think, some of your writing and some of the things you've said seem to reflect James's pragmatic view. That is to say, if this question is open, like the existence of God, and it's better for me to believe it, then why not believe it? Is that a fair representation of what James is saying? And
I think that's a fair thing, and he also points out that there's a will to believe. You might recognize that something, you might see it as being, it'd be very helpful to believe in God, but it's just not an option for you, right? You can't will yourself to believe in certain things that just don't land for you. So I think that's important to recognize as well. Again, I would say that my primary thing is always being sort of seeing as things as leanings as opposed to firm convictions. And so I entertain material reductionism, but I lean towards some kind of larger ontology. And I lean towards there being some sort of intelligence that's embedded into physical reality, and I lean towards free will. And all of those leanings, I would say, are driven by a pragmatic sentiment. So yes, you can totally explain sort of the anthropic principle in terms of there just being this infinite number or near infinite number of universes with different properties. But you could also explain it by there being some sort of intelligence in the universe. And given that both of those I feel are defensible, I lean towards the one that resonates and that sort of works better in life. And similarly with free will, you could totally explain free will as an illusion. And I think in many situations it is. We do things without understanding why we're doing them, and we need to recognize that a lot of our actions, we don't really understand the basis for a lot of our actions. And I sympathize with some of Sam Harris's thought experiments where ideas just sort of pop to mind and I don't really know where they came from. But there are other times where you really feel it, like there's something you need to do. It's a hard thing to do. You don't want to do it. And you need to, you can feel it. You have to muster this courage. You have to muster this self agency to make yourself do this thing. And I feel that the effort of initiating that kind of action, that really feels like I'm doing that. There's a consciousness is contributing to my taking that difficult step. And so that's definitely a situation where the pragmatics of it and the phenomenology, I think, which is related to the to pragmatism, that if all things being equal, if one really resonates with your lived experience, then that's something to consider. I know people say we have all sorts of illusions, but even the knowledge that we have all sorts of illusions, how did we get that knowledge? Through science, which is based on observation, which is based on lived experience. So it comes one way or the other, it comes back to lived experience.
yeah, I mean, as for the illusion part, science has this unfortunate tendency of dismissing anything as illusion that doesn't fit into its little materialistic worldview. So let's turn to one of James's most famous works, which is The Varieties of Religious Experience, in which he describes religious experience from any number of angles, from any number of types of people, many ages. How does religious experience of this kind fit into models that you're comfortable with?
Well, first, I mean, I think William James had some really valuable things to say about the ontological significance of those experiences. And essentially what he said is that, if someone, say, has a mystical experience and it changes the way that they understand reality, that is entirely defensible for them to base their worldview on those experiences, because those experiences, they could be realer than real. They can be of such level of profundity that it just changes the way they understand it. And that's totally defensible for them, but they can't then expect me, somebody else, to just take their word for it. So it's great that you had that experience and you now believe this particular thing. I respect you for that, but that doesn't mean that I should necessarily believe it as well. But that said, there are some very interesting experiences that William James talked about, in particular, mystical experiences. And this is sort of a perennial thing that you see in many, many different religions and out of religions, people have these experiences who don't really have a mystical, or excuse me, a religious perspective, where they experience a oneness with the rest of the world, and a sense of connection, and a loss of individual ego. And I think the perennial quality of those experiences, that they show up in so many different contexts, speaks to the plausibility that they're telling us something with ontological merit. Doesn't prove that, but I think it's consistent with that. And so I find his descriptions of these mystical experiences some of the most beautiful documentation that I've ever encountered. And it does, I think, speak to the plausibility that those experiences tell us something larger about the nature of reality.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Certainly, um, you know, an individual has no particular reason to expect anyone else to believe him, which is why most mystics keep their mouths shut most of the time, at least the smart ones do. I mean, but conversely, the materialist position is these things don't fit into my reality, therefore they're illusions. I was interviewing a professor of religious studies who said, well, he said, science says we can explain everything on the table. And he said, well, that's because you've taken everything you can't explain off the table. And that does seem to be prevalent, and it's both intellectually limiting and perhaps socially destructive.
Yeah, well, it's going to be very interesting. There's this uh, documentary podcast that has become was the number one most listened to podcast, the Telepathy Tapes. I don't know if you've heard or encountered them, but basically the claim there is that these non-verbal autistic kids are able to telepathically communicate in sort of remarkable detail with their caregivers and others. And the documentation that's included in the telepathy tapes is mixed at best. There are many examples which really seem like they could be explained through sort of standard channels, but there's some which are really quite striking, where the nonverbal is not being touched by the parent, and seems to be able to pick up some rather substantial information. So it'll be very interesting to see. They're doing follow-up research now that's being led by scientists, and hopefully will be more rigorously conducted, and that may create some scientific observations that could potentially be a real challenge to the existing view. And the thing about these kinds of things is that you just need, one polka dotted yellow and purple ostrich to say that polka dotted yellow and purple ostriches are possible. So if you just get even one really, really well-documented strong case of somebody showing something like telepathy, then that will be very compelling. Now, critics will say, they've been trying to do that for hundreds of years, and we still don't see why do we think we're going to see it now. But this is a unique population, and they may have, the claim has been that they have special skills. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. I do feel like it's also interesting to see how the scientists the majority of scientists have just dismissed it out of hand. There was something called facilitated learning, which was debunked in the past, where the people held the autistic person's hand. And so the claim is, well, this is just that. That's been debunked. This can't be true. And plus, it's based on this crazy notion of telepathy, which can't be true. So they basically dismiss things without even necessarily investigating them thoroughly, because my mind's made up. Don't confuse me with the facts.
Let's talk about scientific research on parapsychology, which is, scientific research. It's scientific in all of the senses normally given. And the research over the last century indicates over and over again that there is, yes, a slight but slightly higher than statistically average piece of evidence for things like psychokinesis, telepathy, clairvoyance, and so on. What do you think of this whole area? Does any of that make sense to you?
Well, first off, as I mentioned before, and I've written a paper on this, where I make the case that we should be entertaining without endorsing. At this point, that's my assessment of the evidence. I think that there is sizable bodies of literature in telepathy, psychokinesis, and these other things reporting positive results. But as you said, it's just like science, and science itself has been figuring out ways in which non-reproducible results can make their way into the scientific literature through basically you collect data and then you analyze it one way, or you analyze it another, and you leave out one covariate. There are various things that can be done. The only way to really get around this is through something known as pre-registration, where you say at the outset exactly how you're going to conduct the study and exactly how you're going to analyze it. And so the question is, how many parapsychological studies have been conducted with positive results that have been published? And the answer is, to my knowledge, so far, none. There are no published studies reporting significant parapsychological effects using pre-registration. And there are part of the problem has been Dean Raiden, a major parapsychologist, introduced me to a concept called the decline effect, which I actually have investigated substantially myself. Part of the reason is that it's, and he said that these parapsychological effects, if you keep replicating them, they will get smaller, that it's like meta-parapsychological phenomena. And so that level, when you get into the meta, and where the active observation itself can make the effect go away, that makes it really problematic, and especially problematic for people who, are disinclined to believe this type of thing in the first place. But so my short answer is that a lot of studies have been out there. There have not been sufficient number of, or really any significant pre-registered parapsychological studies, and that is now the gold standard for evaluating the reality of phenomena.
Well, since you obviously know Dean Raiden, would he agree with what you just stated about these pre-registration models?
I think he would say that the pre-registration, I think he would have to agree that there are no published. He may know some that I don't know of. So, but I recently looked into it and was unable to find any published ones. Maybe he knows the ones that I don't. I think he would say that the pre-registration locks people in to a excessively narrow way of investigating the evidence, and that you need to have the flexibility to be able to tweak your analyses in light of what you discover when you run the studies. And I think that's fair, but then you need to replicate that study with the tweaked parameters and do it exactly the way you did it the last time and show that it works. And that's really the bar that has yet to be passed.
Just one last question. I mean, there is a bit of controversy in the scientific community about this whole issue of replication, and the number of studies that have been successfully replicated is actually remarkably small. And of course, that doesn't include all of the ones that they never bothered to publish or never got published anyway. Is this issue of replicability as big a problem in science as some would seem to be implying?
Oh, this is a thorny subject, and one which hits close to my heart because I have a particular paper that on replicability that was retracted with an invitation to resubmit due to some errors that we made with respect to how we pre-registered certain aspects of the study. So this hits kind of close to the bone. But what I would say is that science is not broken, that bridges still stand, and ships still sail, and airplanes fly, and medicines work, and that the exact and many findings replicate. And I think that when you have findings that have not been replicated, I think that those findings need to be held in greater question until they've been replicated. That researchers should encourage other researchers to attempt to replicate their work as best that they can. When studies don't replicate, that should raise questions about them, but not necessarily mean that the finding is not valid. It may be that there can be problems in the original study, or there can be problems in the replication. I think that what has emerged from this whole process is a really burgeoning field of metascience, where the lens of science is turned onto the scientific process itself. And I think that's really been one of the great positive outcomes of the whole reproducibility crisis, is that we're learning so much more about the scientific process, about the mistakes the scientists can make, about the ways to make the potential ways to make science more robust. And I just hope that we can do that without losing the wonder and the sort of free-spirited exploratory quality that science oftentimes entails. I think it's important to pre-register, but I think people still need to go through their data and do all the exploratory analyses and see what other things might be there. Somebody once said that the greatest discoveries are typically not associated with aha, but that's strange, right? So we need to really continue to look for the surprises and explore those surprises and be open-minded to what they might mean. But in doing so, when we find a surprising thing, don't just rush off and say, there, it's like this. Figure out exactly what the implications of that surprising thing is. Run a study to replicate and test it, and pre-register that study so that you can demonstrate that this is not just through sort of means of what's known as p-hacking to that new conclusion. So I think science is actually stronger as a result of this reproducibility issue, because we now understand the process better.
And of course, this all assumes that every scientist is always working in completely good faith, but I suppose that's an issue for meta science as well. But,
Yeah, they're out there, but I think the deliberate frauds are, and this is my opinion. There's some evidence for this. The deliberate frauds are quite rare. I think the much more pernicious problem is where glass half empty, half full, sort of seeing things through rose-colored glasses, like we were saying before, over-interpreting findings where you're not deliberately trying to mislead anyone. It's just in your enthusiasm, or in their enthusiasm, they may sort of distort the picture unwittingly.
well, that's great. I mean, we've really run up to our time limit. So unless you have anything you particularly like to add, I think we should wrap up here.
I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'd invite people to visit my website. It's if you just Google Meta Lab UCSB, you'll find it. And lots of the topics that we discussed today will can be found there, as well as many interviews like the one we had today.